have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker, licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to it, folks. It's Thursday. We're getting close. We're towards the end of the week. Hopefully, we're all making good headway. I feel like I'm walking through concrete. I'm up to my ankles in concrete. It's not been a fast week. Hope it's better for you. Got an interesting update to kind of contrast to the Robert got it wrong about October news. At least there is at least one other thing that I got right. So we'll talk about that. And apparently the folks over at Realty Times have decided that I was right. I'm assuming just because they say it right, that I was right doesn't mean that I was right. But I think that the data proves it. So we'll cover that as well. There's a few other interesting tidbits. So don't head off early because we got some interesting things to cover. A little bit more kind of sitting in the couch, philosophizing a little bit about some things in terms of just maybe sharing what could be coming in the future for us. So stick with us. And to jump right into the Robert Got It Right news, we can hit an article that comes to us from Realty Times. As always, these articles will be linked in the show notes, so make sure to check those out if you want to get more information. Their headline is, Proof That We Jump to Conclusions About Millennials and Home Buying. Ever since the millennial generation reached adulthood, demographers and social scientists have been exploring the many trends that set this younger generation apart from their parents and grandparents. These studies have confirmed that millennials are very different from Generation X and the baby boomers in many ways. One supposed difference was that that's recently proven to be incorrect is a lack of interest among millennials in buying houses. So we can get into the details of this. We've been covering this projection on the part of the folks out in the world that call themselves experts for quite a while. For the last couple of years, there were expectations. They were talking about the great millennial this or that and how a general lack of interest in buying, or that there was going to be a wave or there wasn't going to be a wave. And the truth of the matter, what we were selling here on my show, and which may vary from what the current research shows, but we'll take a look at that as well because they do present that in this particular article. Now, though, what's the case I made? Now, my case was based on looking at what I was seeing with people I was actually interacting with. There are a heck of a lot of millennials floating around here in the Bay Area. And of course, they may be a completely different kind of millennial compared to the rest of the country. But I felt like I was seeing the result they were trying to measure. In other words, folks not buying. But I saw a slightly different motivation for it. It was not out of desire. It was not because they didn't want to. It was forced on them, really. A lot of them, it was strictly a circumstances situation. And my argument was, these folks, in terms of wanting to buy a house, are no different than anybody else. They just don't find it to... The one difference is that a lot of them kind of came of age while things were going nuts the last time around, 10 years ago. So that obviously played into it, but so much of it was less of a I don't want to buy a house kind of a thing and more about just simply not being able to. They were graduating with more debt than everyone else before them. It was a necessity call on their part. And we kind of were calling it differently from what most of the pundits were calling. But we can go ahead and review this a little bit. The assumptions that they point out here in the article are assumptions regarding millennials and home ownership have evolved considerably over the past several years. As recently as 2015, the prevailing explanation for historically low rates of home purchases among the younger generation was that millennials simply didn't want to buy their own homes. Now, when that was being put out there, I did not find that to be the case. I would have folks contacting me, but it was simply something that was out of reach for them for financial reasons. One thing we did find that I think is still true, and we'll see if these folks bear that out, is that millennials would like to skip the starter home. They don't want to do the whole buy and then buy again in 5 years when the family gets bigger. They don't want to buy the 2-bedroom or the 1-bedroom. They wanted to get at least the 3-bedroom, right? They wanted to future-proof their purchase a little bit and potentially stay in the house longer. At least that's what I was hearing from folks that I was dealing with. And then they get into some of the other things that we talked about here on this show in terms of factors that they thought supported their idea that they didn't want to buy, including decline in marriage rates, driving down demand for single-family homes. Millennials are less likely than other generations to stay in a job for a long period of time. It was thought that they might be renting in order to maintain mobility. But that didn't bear out either, because on this show, we cover lots of data, right? We try to cross the streams of our data. And one thing we were seeing was that the millennials weren't horribly mobile. They weren't picking up and going from A to B, at least not the millennials. We talked about a lot of folks coming and going and leaving and not staying in certain places. Here in the Bay Area, there are some great examples in terms of surveys where well over, I can't remember what the latest numbers are. I know it's well over 30% want to leave, but that's of everybody, not just millennials. I'm in that list. If someone were to come and ask me, do I want to leave? I'd be all, yes, sir. May I please? And I'm hopefully working towards that. But in my case, there's obviously mitigating circumstances when you get your broker's license in a state. So if I want to be able to do what I do in another state, I got to get my broker's license there. But that's a different subject. Other millennial attitudes toward home buying has emerged in this version. Millennials wanted to buy houses, but simply couldn't afford to save for their down payments. And that's the version we were always selling. That's the version that always made sense. And now that's something else that they've kind of embraced here. But here's what the most recent research is tending to point out. Researchers began looking into their specific plans and ability to do so more closely. Among the roughly 2/3 of millennials who don't already own homes, a majority report that they plan to own a home at some point in their lives. What was more surprising than this, however, is the fact that 68% of millennials plan on owning more than one home in the future. This finding indicates that while mobility may still be a factor, I would argue it is not. I don't think there's a lot of data to show the whole millennials are a more mobile generation than other generations. May still be a factor millennials consider. They plan to approach it through serial home ownership rather than through perennial renting. Another encouraging statistic with regards to millennial home ownership rates is the fact that some 40% of this generation, who are over the age of 25, have begun saving in earnest for the down payment in a house. In part, this may be part of an effort to save money, as new studies have shown that buying is now less expensive than renting in 42 of the 50 U.S. states. So in terms of the mobility stuff, and I've had folks talk to me about what they thought was happening with millennials, and again, it's the kind of conversation you have while you're sitting in a comfy chair drinking your favorite comfy beverage, right? For me, that might be a mocha. Who knows? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is being able to anticipate what is going to come out the other end, right? The why of it may not be quite as important. But the reality is I wasn't seeing high levels of mobility among millennials except for right after college. Right after they get out of college, those first few years, all bets are off. A whole ton of them ended up back in mom and dad's basement or in their old bedroom. Mobility took on a little bit of a new thing simply because they were willing to go where they could get jobs to a certain degree, but not a whole lot more than previous generations. What I'm interested in now in terms of my local data is we've talked about how folks that are sort of empty nesters now that are in that age group we were talking about yesterday, the 50, 55 plus, are tending to move out of the area. What I find also interesting is I see, and this is a little bit more difficult, right? Because people aren't going to come to me if they want to find out what it will cost to buy a house in another state, right? They're going to come to me when they want to find a house or when they want to sell a house they have here. So I'm not going to get a ton of renting. I'm not going to get any renting millennials who are considering moving to another part of the country. But I do talk to folks, and I this is the kind of job where you tend to interact a lot with people. And the vibe I get is that a lot of folks are actively looking for positions outside of the Bay Area. It's really interesting because this feels to be even more the case than in past years. Now, to sort of calibrate you to that, I've lived in the Bay Area nearly all my life. I spent a couple of years living overseas. I spent 1 year living in Florida. But for the most part, I have been in this Bay Area my entire life. I was born in San Francisco, raised in San Jose, in the San Jose Cupertino area. Went to elementary school, high school, college here. So I'm a local boy when it comes to Silicon Valley. And I guess we could discount anything before high school in terms of being really self-aware enough or aware enough in general of whether or not people do or don't want to be here. But I have to tell you, as far as counting, at least from the time I've had a job since I was 16 years old. I've never seen a time when when such a great number of people felt that the best way to serve themselves was to move away from here. It's kind of amazing. It's a bit of a change. So for me locally, that's a dynamic. But again, it's not a millennial specific thing. It's people of all ages. My age, folks younger than millennials. My sons are all considering the option of not living here when they finally finish with college and move on to do whatever it is they're going to do. So it's all sort of there. The interesting things to note about a marketplace. No way of telling what that means for California in general. California does a lot of goofy things that I think alienate an awful lot of people that they probably in the long run don't want to alienate. But we'll see, and that's not something you need to worry about if your market is in another state. But from the standpoint of just understanding what was up with millennials and where they were going and what their motivations were, I think of all the folks out there sort of trying to understand the motivations of millennials, I think we kind of had our finger on it. I think we have been the closest to the truth of most of the folks. I'm sure there's others who got it as well or were paying attention and sort of exploring that. But in terms of the big players out there, in terms of the big news folks, the Realty Times folks, the ABCs, NBCs, the Bloombergs, the Fortune, all those folks, we never agreed with them here. And I think we've been proven to be right on the money in terms of what we thought was going on with millennials. All right, next, I want to talk to you about how maybe we need to be a little bit more worried about what's going to happen with interest rates. We'll cover that in just a minute, so don't go away.
Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right, aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909.
Welcome back, everyone. With that little teaser just before the break, what should we be thinking about interest rates? By and large, over the past couple of years, we have been watching interest rates, and here on this show, the mantra has pretty much been, don't worry about interest rates going nuts. We've been right. I think one of the another example of us really calling it correctly has been when you do see the rates go up a little bit, don't panic, and also don't lock in your rate right after the Fed does it, because it'll go up a little bit and then it'll go down. And every time that we called that, we ended up being correct, to the point where not only did the rates go back down, in most cases, they went down below what they were before the Fed raised the prime rate. Rates are a little higher than they were a little bit ago right now. We can talk about rates if that seems like a good way to go, but they're still in general down. They're nowhere near the 52-week high. They're kind of floating right in the middle between the 52-week high and low. So, and they're below 4%. When I looked the other day, it was 3.8% for a loan. So still ridiculously awesome rates. But Interesting article, and this is yet another one that is really more something to tease your brain with. This is a headline from Zero Hedge. And of course, as always, with some stories from Zero Hedge, you need to put on your tinfoil hat. But I always just like when they take data. They seem to be pretty good at just presenting data. So when you focus just on that, this becomes interesting. But the headline they have for this story is 700 years of data. Yeah, 700 years. That was the first thing that keyed me. How do you have 700 years of data on anything? 700 years of data suggests the reversal in rates will be rapid. So it broaches this idea that rates could suddenly take off, that the transition from low rates, which is what we're experiencing now, could just ridiculously jump. Now, do I think that's possible? Yeah. But usually it's going to have some sort of a precipitating event, right? There's going to have to be a thing that happens, and it doesn't need to be the Fed jacks around with the prime lending rate, right? The prime rate. It doesn't have to deal with that at all. In fact, odds are that won't be what causes rates to skyrocket. Now, this article is kind of interesting. It goes over the 700-year average of 4.78%. Which they put out there as the real risk-free rate since 1311. Man, if anything screams for what are your sources on this, that's this. But it's interesting because what they see here, or what they track, is rapid changes in interest rates. Examples in history of the change coming very quickly after bad things happen. And that kind of makes it interesting. Reversals from real rate depressions is another interesting chart that you can check out here if you want to go check out the show notes at therebelbroker.com. If we skip down to their conclusion, we find his conclusion, the writer of this article, that a rapid, nonlinear recovery in real rates can occur without any decisive events or policy. Almost counterintuitive. It doesn't feel like it's about to happen, but maybe it didn't in the 1890s either. Indeed, maybe the best analogy for rates today is the proverbial beach ball held underwater. So their claim here is that there's no precipitating event, that there really isn't some big thing that happens. And I think that we can wrap our heads around that to a certain degree in terms of understanding a set of things that all kind of happen at the same time, right? That's also the kind of thing. It's like the Goldberg machine, right? Where you don't expect anything to blow up, but when a certain number of things happen in sequence, suddenly you've got the plunger being pushed down on the explosives when all you did was push down a domino at the front end, right? And as long as the right things happen between those two things, really catastrophic things that can occur. It's an interesting read. I put it out there really more for you to sort of bounce it around in your head, but it's reasonable enough and it pulls from history enough that I think it is, if anything, it is an encouragement to more decisive action. So if you decide you want to make a deal happen and interest rates are good for you, make the move, make the decisive move. Don't delay in taking a move because you believe interest rates are likely to just hover at some very low level for a very long time. Because remember, we like to believe we have systems that control that stuff, but we don't. It's really all make-believe, right? All of the stuff that the Fed does, all these other things were designed to solve specific problems like huge bubbles. Well, it didn't. All it did was make the bubbles bigger and deeper and wider when they do happen. So there really is no direct control. It's a false sense of security, really, that's getting sold with a lot of these things. So take a look at that. I'm not going to read through the whole article, but it might be a fun thing for you to check out over at therebelbroker.com in the show notes for today's show. Now, finally today, one other thing I wanted to give everyone an update on and really kind of bring to the forefront something I've been pushing for a long time, because so much of what we do relates to employment, right? And the underpinnings of a strong rental base is jobs. The underpinnings of a strong ability on the part of more people to buy is jobs that facilitate an income that allow that. And one of the things I've been harping on for a long time has been automation. And we've covered everything from fast food restaurants, to homes being built by robots, to driverless cars, automated driving cars. We talked about how the biggest industries that are going to get hit by this are going to be transportation. It's going to be the 18-wheelers. It's going to be the buses that move people from A to B. That's exactly what's been happening. And everybody who has been calling it and talking about when we need to worry about this has been saying 2025, 2030. And I was suggesting that we needed to be more ready for this, more mentally prepared for this dynamic to exist in the marketplace by 2020. So I thought I'd share with you, and there have been tons of other articles. I haven't really shared every one of them with you. Maybe I should start doing that again. But there's an interesting article that is, again, another one from Zero Hedge that they're actually getting from somewhere else. I'm not sure where the original story was published. Headline, fully self-driving cars are here. Waymo to begin testing driver-free autonomous taxis in Phoenix. So we're there. A lot of these folks that were anticipating that it was going to take forever to get actual driverless cars on the road, I guess we're assuming legislation was going to hold things up. I always knew in the back of my head if anything was going to push this forward through that system, is there's just too many invested folks that are going to get a lot of benefit from this stuff happening. But this is a story that comes from Phoenix. If you see a car without a driver meandering around suburban Phoenix, don't be alarmed. It's just Google's Waymo division testing its new driverless taxi, the first of their kind to be tested on U.S. roads without the supervision of a safety driver. So there is no safety driver. None. If you lived in the Bay Area, you'd know one thing that Google is now owns the hangar over at what used to be the Moffett Naval Air Station, which has become Moffett Federal Airfield. But there's a hangar there. It's the largest hangar on the West Coast. It used to house the lighter-than-air ships for the U.S. Navy. Those all got taken out in a storm sometime back in the 50s or 60s. And so it's really been more or less empty. They've been parking planes in there, and there were little teeny buildings inside and whatnot. But one thing that's interesting is if you drive by there and you see two giant trucks driving in circles, if you look closely, you'll notice there's no people in them. That has been Google testing those vehicles. And what's amazing about this technology is you can't simply dismiss it as, well, that's just taxis. Now, if you happen to know a taxi driver or you are a taxi driver, this might scare you. But the real issue here is everything that they can learn from this vehicle driving autonomously informs every other autonomous vehicle. The data here is going to be just as applicable to that 18-wheeler or that bus. Granted, the parameters of the vehicle will be different, and those are just configuration files, right? You have configuration files that understand thrust and speed and mass and when you need to start braking to stop and all these things. That math is going to be separate for each vehicle. But in terms of recognizing the area, understanding that there's a person on the sidewalk next to you, understanding that you're on the right side of the road, all of those things, totally independent of the vehicle itself. Remember, we talked about this. One reason why I said this was going to happen so much faster than everything else is it's no longer a hardware problem. It's a software problem. As soon as you design systems that you can just plop onto a car that absorb enough of the surrounding area, it's no longer a question of having to give the car more hardware to do the job. It's simply a question of getting the software that interprets the input correctly, right? Updating the drivers for the tools that are used to get data from the outside world. So the development process, the improvement process is ridiculously accelerated because every time there's a change, you're not physically changing the vehicle. You're just plugging in a USB cable and you're updating the software. So it's happening. I think it is happening at a ridiculous pace, the pace we anticipated, the pace I suggested it was going to come in at. And while I think there will be huge resistance from certain corners, I think unions are going to have a big problem with this. Pretty soon, as I said last year, you're going to be, or earlier this year, it will not be too long before you will be able to buy a fast food meal untouched by human hands in any way. It just makes sense. There's too much robotic stuff going on, and particularly in areas where the minimum wage has just made it a financially reasonable thing to spend the money on the automation required in those scenarios. But it's gonna hit a whole bunch of different stuff. Imagine all those industries that rely on truck drivers crossing the country, needing to stop and take showers, sleep for the night, get food. All these little communities that are surviving and thriving on that traffic that isn't going to happen anymore. They're going to get rid of the human being. They're going to get rid of the sleeping area in the back. They're going to add fuel, extend the range, and these things may need to stop for fueling, but it won't be nearly as often as before. And I think that's going to be an interesting thing to see evolve. All right, folks. I do hope that we've left you with more value in terms of things to think about, ways to approach your business, or maybe some new avenues to consider in terms of making the very best investment decisions you can. That's always the goal, to leave you with more value than you invested in time. Hope we've done it today. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to y'all next time.